But we've called this Finding Ourselves Again. And I think the one thing that I particularly want to emphasize is that this is for us as human beings, as much as for us as ministers or practitioners or whatever other phrase you might want to use. And we've called this particular opening session Finding Ourselves and Finding Our Calling. And as I've said, we particularly want to focus today on who we are as people. Now, I realize that there's a whole load of technical issues and all kinds of practicalities and leadership issues that we're going to need to look at as well. And I just would remind you, as we were putting today's content together, we were conscious, of course, that we also did an online Latchford session, which I know quite a number of you were at a couple of weeks ago. And the material from that day is still available. So I make no apology for the fact that we are particularly going to focus on ourselves as people today, because we very deliberately made the focus 2 weeks ago at the Latchford Learning Day on the leadership issues and some of the practicalities. So if actually you come away from today and think, I would have liked more help with some of the practical stuff, all of the PowerPoint presentations and the spoken presentations from that Latchford Day are available via the website. Just look for the link Plague on the Land, and Tim has put the link as well into the chat box. So we're going to try and focus on who we are today as leaders and as ministers. And I want to suggest that actually that this title, Finding Ourselves Again, invites us to look in two directions. It invites us to look backwards, and it also invites us to look forwards. It invites us to look back because I think for some of the conversations that I have found myself having over the last few weeks or even months have been that actually in some ways this experience of lockdown, the changes that brought the changes that brought. I'm going to switch the chat box off because thanks for the heckling, Brian, but I realize it's going to put me off, so I'll just get rid of that for a moment. You know, we've said, you know, there's things I've done, there's things that have happened that I find myself doing things that actually feel more real to my ministry. You know, I've been saying to many people, for me, at a personal level, I've kind of gone from the person who travels around to different places with a relatively consistent message to going back to the days of when I was a local church minister, where I'm largely speaking to the same group of people every week and having to preach a kind of progressive message, if you like, and just realizing that in some respects I'm going back. I found myself again as a local pastor and a local preacher, and I suspect that that's my story. Your story will be different, and a lot of what I want to share today is about offering you a framework for your story, not necessarily assuming that yours is the same as anybody else's. And so there will be things that we bring to today that we're perhaps saying, you know, I've found myself again. There are things that I've done, there are things that I've said, there are things I'm doing now that I have just rediscovered. And again, that is not necessarily just related to ministry. You know, there are lots of people who are refinding old hobbies, who are revisiting places in their local areas that they'd forgotten existed. So again, I think we need to bring the whole of ourselves to that. But I guess too that there is a dimension of this that causes us to look forward, to look in the other direction, excuse me, and to say, you know, I have lost things. We have lost certain aspects of life. How are we going to find ourselves again in this future, in this new normal, or whatever else we choose to call it? And so to me, this is a title that invites us to look in both of those directions, because again, there may be things that we've found again in the last 12 months that we want to carry forward into the future, and there are things that perhaps we feel we've lost that we want to re-find in the future. And I think, speaking as for a moment as a regional minister, I also want to say that to me, this is a conversation that we need to have on at least two levels, because NWBA also needs to find itself again. And part and parcel of that is saying, well, how have we learned to associate? How do we need to associate? What resources, what support do we need as we look to the future? So what a regional association might look and feel like in the future may not be what it was 5 years ago. And that again may be a mix of the things that we've learned and rediscovered in the last 12 months, or the things that we realize we need to learn and discover as we go forward. But in this session, I particularly want to begin, and I think these two things overlap constantly, but I want to begin by particularly just taking some time to take stock and to look back. And as I think about this idea of, well, how have I found myself again in the last 12 months or so? I guess that some of the things that we might bring to that are what I've called here reclaiming my core calling. Maybe finding that I am spending, I had a conversation with someone the other day, and I was just saying, we said to one another, it's been really good that we've just had a 20-minute conversation, just a pastoral interaction, because in the old world, we kind of would have just, what do you need to know? This is what I need to know. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And we just felt, because we're in this new world, or this different world, we've got more time for each other. And there may be other things like that. But as you reflect on the last 12 months, however that's worked out for you, there may be things, and there may not be things. This may be different for different ones of us. But there may be things that you say, yeah, I rediscovered something of my calling as a minister. I rediscovered something of my calling as a leader, as a disciple of Jesus in the last 12 months. And I kind of just need to hold on to that. I need to recognize that that's part of the finding myself that has gone on. And then again, I guess that, as I hinted a couple of moments ago, the last 12 months has perhaps for some of us given us space to be other things. I've got to be honest here, and please don't communicate this too widely, but it comes as something of a relief to me that the day that we are doing the Ministers Conference is also the day that my 12-year-old daughter's school reopens. So I'm not looking at the clock thinking, at 10:45, lessons are going to finish, there's going to be an almighty great outburst of noise in the other room, as all that energy has to now dissipate at home. So, our relationship as a family has been different over the last 12 months. It's been very different being a dad when you're working from home to how it is when a lot of your time you're working away. Now, again, I can only tell my story. We'll all have our own different story. But maybe as we look back over the last 12 months, we say, yeah, I've had space to be other things. And as I look to the future, will I still have that space? What is it I want to take with me? And dare I say that the other thing is that perhaps we've just had more time over the last 12 months to simply be aware of ourselves, and perhaps just spend, as we often call it, me time, or we might call it retreat if we want to try and make it spiritual. But perhaps we have just become more self-aware. Perhaps we have just become more aware of some of the stress that the 12 months before the last 12 months was placing on us, or perhaps we have become more stressed in the last 12 months. But this experience has put us in touch with ourselves, perhaps, as more than maybe we had, or in different ways to how we did in the past. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is a comprehensive list, and I'm not saying you have to tick all of these boxes. It may be that one of them really resonates with you, and another of those three, absolutely, it just doesn't do it for you. You say, no, that's just not been my story. Or it may be that actually none of those work for you, but there are other things that you would want to put in that space. But part of today, I think, is just a simple invitation to invite you to spend some time. We're going to spend quite a bit of time off screen today to just think about, okay, how have I found myself in the 12 months or so that have now passed? And as I think about that, for me, it starts to raise some questions. To what degree am I the person I was 12 months ago? It strikes me that there are those. I mean, perhaps we've engaged with people online, but equally there are those we have maybe lost touch with over the last 12 months, and we're going to be reconnecting with them again at some point, probably in the next 6. to what degree have I changed in that period? And of course, what we've got to recognize is that they will have changed too. But to what degree is their vision of me still the person I was a year ago? And I think, that this has been something that's really come home to me, because our daughter Emma is just at that age, going 11 to 12, when she should have left and finished at primary school and moved into high school in the normal world. And so, I look at one member of our household and think, I probably am not that different to the person I was. The person I am at 58 isn't that different to the person I was at 57. But for her, at 11 going to 12 is a huge change in the person she is. And of course, the point is that we may say, well, no, I haven't changed a great deal, but many of the people we engage with will have changed and will have been impacted in different ways. To what degree am I the person I was? How am I seeking to be different as I now think about the future that confronts us? And what am I seeking to reclaim? Again, coming back to this thought of perhaps we are sitting here today thinking, for 12 months now, I've not been able to do X or Y, or I've had to do it in a way that I feel deeply uncomfortable with. And there are things that perhaps are even more intensely important to me now that I haven't done for the last 12 months, that I am desperate to reclaim. And the point that I really want to make through all of this, again, this is not intended to be an expert or anything else. I'm simply trying to offer you a framework to say, how am I taking time to really reflect on what the last 12 months has meant for me as a person, and for me as a minister, and for me in the role that I have been in. And as I thought about that, and as I tried to take myself a little bit on that journey, I found myself thinking that, therefore, as I look to the future, I begin to sense that I see chances, what I'm calling here, chances and contradictions. I see that there are things that I can look and say, I've got a chance now to do X or Y, because we're going into a different world, or because people have got used to this or that. I have a chance now to do something differently. And again, you may be sitting here today, as you think about ministry, think about your particular role, whether that's as a local church minister, whether it's as a pioneer, whether it's as a chaplain. I've got a chance to do things differently going forward. But perhaps there are also those things that are contradictions. It was interesting when we did the conference 2 weeks ago, Plague on the Land, that when I was editing it before we put it online, I heard myself say that looking at some of the expectations, they terrify me. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a strong word. Should I edit that out? And in the end, I thought, no, I'm going to leave it in. If it was a pre-recorded thing, I maybe wouldn't have used that phrase. But what I found interesting was that in conversations in the following 10 days, 3 people used that word to me who hadn't heard me say it. They said, I am terrified about looking to the future, because I'm beginning to see contradictions between what I've become in the last 12 months or so and what people expect me to go back to being when things go forward, or simply that there are those who are looking for me to be the person I've become, to be this provider of online services every Sunday, but another load of people who are expecting me to get the church building open as quickly as possible and to have everything back to the way it used to be. And I just see the contradiction of those expectations, and I just feel myself in the middle of them. Again, these will be different for different ones of us, but I suspect that one way of describing the landscape that we look forward to is one of chances and one of contradictions. And I particularly want to focus in on this word contradictions for a moment. If you did happen to join us for the NWBA online service for this week, you'll know that we looked at these words of Paul: we preach Christ crucified. And of course, that phrase, we preach Christ crucified, at one level is a contradiction. And the point I want to make is that as a gospel people, we're not exactly alien to the idea of living in contradiction. because for those who heard Paul say this, as Paul himself says, the Greeks say this is nonsense. The Jews, this is a stumbling block, because it is a contradiction. You cannot be the Christ, the victorious one, the overcomer, the deliverer, and the crucified one, the one who is impaled by the oppressor. And yet Paul says, no, you can. We preach Christ crucified, because in many respects, it's not so much a contradiction, but a paradox. And I made the great mistake at this point in my preparation of deciding to Google what is the difference between a contradiction and a paradox. And of course, what I found myself immediately led to by the great wise Google was all kinds of philosophy departments of universities. And I really wish I hadn't in the end. So I'm going to offer you my interpretation of the difference between a contradiction and a paradox. But if you really want to get Google's, just give yourselves about 3 days and a good dictionary of philosophy, and you may be able to find your way through it. But it struck me that the difference between a contradiction and a paradox is that a contradiction is when two elements are inconsistent and they need to be resolved. They just cannot. One of them must be wrong, or both of them must be wrong, because they cannot both describe reality. But a paradox is when we say, actually, these two inconsistent elements actually cause us to revisit that reality and to recognize that there is something deeper to discover in the light of their coexistence. And it seems to me that the point that Paul is making is that preaching Christ crucified is not a contradiction, it's a paradox. It is in the apparent contradiction that we learn and we recognize the depth of meaning of the gospel and of the message of Jesus, and we recognize the depth of the kingdom of God, and so we could continue. And therefore, I want to invite you to perhaps stop and think, okay, can we use that idea of a paradox as a way of looking at some of the contradictions that we may feel that we are facing as we look to the future? How are we going to live as individuals? How are we going to survive as people in some of the paradox of these conflicts of expectation that we may be wrestling with? And again, what I want to do is simply offer some of those perhaps elements of paradox, not saying that this is a comprehensive list, not saying that even this is the best list, but hopefully it will get you thinking about, well, what are the paradoxes that I am facing? Because that's the important thing to me, is that you find a way of thinking through your own story. And perhaps one of the biggest paradoxes that many of us, or biggest contradictions that many of us are facing at the moment, is what I'm calling the pressure between the reset and the renewal. I certainly hear a lot of voices who are saying, when are we going to reset everything? When are we going to get everything back to the way it was? And a lot of other voices who are saying, wow, look at this great new world we're in. How are we going to completely reinvent ourselves in the light of all that means? And the thing that I'm particularly wanting to bring out here is that certainly many of the conversations that I've had with ministers and with leaders are saying, this is where I see my number one challenge right now. I've got a whole load of voices on one side of me calling for reset, and I've got a whole load of voices on the other side of me calling for renewal. Or even I'm hearing a load of voices for reset, but my inner self is recognizing that this is an opportunity for change. And what I want to suggest is that because for many of us, we've actually encountered this to some degree in conflict, because we do see these two opposing pressure groups, if you like, that we maybe lose sight of the fact that actually it is to some degree a paradox. There are some aspects of reset that every one of us are actually going to need to introduce. We recognize, we are going to reopen our buildings at some point. We may open them for very different purposes. We may be thinking very differently when we arrive in them, but if we have a building, we are going to open it. Even if we're only opening it to let the for sale people come in, we are going to open our building. There are aspects of reset that we're all going to need to embrace, and we should be being a constantly renewed church. So again, I want to suggest to you that these aren't necessarily contradictions, but a part of the paradox of who we are as a gospel people. We are a people of today and tomorrow, but we're a people with a heritage. We're a people with a story. We're a people with a tradition. And there is richness to me to be found in the paradox of living in those two, just as there is richness to be found in the paradox of Christ crucified. I think for many of us too, there is going to be what I'm calling the paradox that is somewhere between our convictions and the expectations. Many of us will have or will come from this 12-month or so period with some real convictions about what our ministry should be about, where our church should be going, but we'll also recognize that there are expectations on us. People will expect things from us. And again, to me, that is part and parcel of ministry. How many times do we sit down on a Monday morning and say, this is what I'm expecting to do this week. This is what, my conviction as a gospel person, as a leader is, but pastoral issues will come up during the week, and we come to the end of the week and we say, I've had to meet expectations that have been placed upon me. And that's not wrong. That's not it's not necessarily because it's not been a useful and a good use of my time and my energy, but we live in that paradox, I would suggest, between a sense of our conviction, our vision for what we should be about, and the expectations that others have upon us. We are a people who are called to live in community. We are the body of Christ. We cannot ignore the expectations that people place on us, but nor can we simply be a constant people pleaser. I sense there's maybe something of a paradox in our call to be incarnational and our call to be countercultural. The gospel is about making the message of Christ known in the culture and in the age in which we find ourselves. Jesus is an enculturation of God's message. But of course, we're also called to be countercultural. We're also called to be those who challenge. And again, what I think is interesting when we bring this to the present context of COVID, to what degree do we need to become incarnate in the struggles of our communities and in meeting the needs around us? And to what degree do we need to continue to challenge? To what degree have some of the things that we were challenging society about 3 years ago, some of those, as we often call them, values of the kingdom, have they become lived out in the emphasis that's placed maybe on key workers, or some of the other ways in which people have chosen to behave in the light of COVID? So again, even as we think about our message at one level to be relevant to society, and at the other side to be challenging society, are those two things still true, but some of the ways we express them are very different. And when I was thinking about this, I was originally going to put the word prophetic and say that the difference between being incarnational and prophetic. But as I thought about that, it struck me that actually, if you look at the Old Testament prophets, they were very good at times as bringing that message of hope and presence in the struggle, and other times challenging. So the prophet actually also lived that paradox between bringing an incarnational message of God's presence to the exiles and the countercultural message of God's challenge to the temple cult. So a prophetic ministry, I would argue, has a degree of both. To what degree do we as leaders need to be prescriptive? Do we need to be saying, look, this is the direction we need to be going in? And to what degree do we need to be receptive to simply allowing people to tell us where they're at and what their needs are? And again, that phrase servant king is a paradox. It's a paradox of a Jesus who is both prescriptive, a command I give you, but also receptive. I wash your feet and you should do the same to one another. To what degree do we need to be missional? Does our focus need to be on being a church in the community and meeting the needs of our community? And to what degree do we need to be saying right now, actually, we need to make sure there's still a church there first. We need to particularly make our focus in the next few months on just kind of regrouping God's people. And again, we may find that there is something of a tension between those two within ourselves. To what degree Do we need to be ideological? Again, having time to stop and think. Perhaps we have become more attached to certain understandings or particular vision, or perhaps, you know, when I first went into ministry, I was really wanted to do X and Y, and I've kind of lost sight of that. And in the last 12 months, I've really got that again. And that's what I might call the ideological. But actually, I've also got to be real. I've got to be practical. I've got to deal with the stuff around me. Again, I'm just thinking about my own life journey and thinking, you know, I haven't seen my kids. They moved away from home and we all went into lockdown. So the ideology of, yeah, I need to be there at the forefront of leading NWBA. I've also got a family to think of. So again, that call between ideological and pragmatic is not necessarily just restricted to any one aspect, but the person we are as a whole person. And something we were talking a little bit this week as an NWBA team, and one of the things that came out of that conversation was, to what degree are we called to be, and to what degree are we called to do? And again, this is nothing new here. This is a classic issue that we face, but we're facing all of these issues again in the light of a new and different and emerging world. But the point that I want us to try and get to is that these things don't need to be contradictions. They don't just need to be conflicts. They can also be places of creativity, places where we can discover deeper realities and deeper things about our calling and our direction. And of course, this is the kind of reality that we are beginning to think about as we look at the roadmap for the future. And I don't know. I've called this slide a stab in the dark, because I think anybody that claims to know what the plan is right now is probably in trouble. But I kind of looked at Boris's roadmap and thought, it feels to me that the kind of landscape that many of us may be imagining, and I'm not saying this is the right one, I tried to kind of think, okay, where do I think the average participant at this NWBA conference is likely to be? And I don't know, but as I looked at the landscape, I thought, I sense that most of us at the moment are recognizing we're still in lockdown, but we need to start thinking about life beyond it. So I've called this, we're kind of in a preparation phase. Around about June-ish, it feels at the moment, I think those who are saying the world is going to restart on June the 21st are frankly kidding themselves. But there will be a season of perhaps refinding ourselves, reopening things, getting things started again. And I'm calling that a period of recovery and discovery. And I'm calling it recovery and discovery because I think we need to use it as a time to listen as well as to perhaps help people simply recover. And I don't know, and I've got to say that I don't think this is, I think this is too soon. But I get the vibe that for many people, they imagine that September of this year, the new different is going to start, or the new normal, or the reset. Now, personally, I think one of the things we perhaps need to do as leaders is to begin to say, I don't think that is the case. You may want to disagree with me. You may think, no, that's a perfectly good roadmap. But I'm just sort of saying that's the kind of vibe in the conversations I'm having with people. That seems to be where people are at the moment, although of course a lot depends on what the outcomes of the going back to school this week are. And I want us to particularly therefore look at this season of preparation, the season that we're in now, and say, okay, what do we need to be doing now as people if we're going to get through this journey? And again, I'm really open to people saying, you know, we think that's completely wrong, it's going to look totally different. I totally get that. But nonetheless, I'd say I think we need to think about what do we need to do now. And it's really that question that brought this theme that we've certainly offered, and you heard that echoed, that Jonathan Clare picked up in the worship, that we've offered for this year for NWBA as rooted. We need to make sure that we're rooted at this time, so that we're ready for whatever comes. And it's that took me back to the words of Paul when he writes to the early churches, because it does strike me that he too is writing into a paradox. Obviously Christ crucified is one of them, but often the paradox for him is his vision of what the church should be and the reality of what's going on. You read some of the parts of Corinthians, you see the same in John to some degree when he writes to the 7 churches in Revelation. There is this vision of the risen Christ. There's the vision of the people of God, the saints around the throne, but then there's the reality of what the church is, that paradox between the if you like, ideological vision of the church and the reality of us as fallen human beings. And it strikes me that what Paul is so good at is he always begins his letters by rooting himself in who he is and who the church is. And I just want to offer you some verses from, first of all, the opening of Romans, which I think is one of the classics, where Paul begins, I am a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. And I make no apology, I've used this a lot in ministers groups before, of just inviting you to take those 3 words, servant of, called to be, set apart for, and say, well, how would you describe yourself in that language that Paul uses here? And again, maybe look at that ideologically, first of all. You know, what is my ideological view of who I am a servant of? And then what is the reality? I'm a servant of my diary, or I'm a servant of the expectations of the congregation. Where is the paradox within that? And what is God saying to me in the midst of that paradox? And Paul is also very good at, for all that he, and I've switched from Romans to Corinthians here, for all that Paul can often rant about some of the things that are going on, about the people who've fallen out with one another, about the practices in worship, he always roots it in these powerful visions of who the church is and what the church is. So again, when he writes to the Corinthians, he's going to talk about them being divided. He's going to talk about chaotic worship. He's going to talk about abuse of spiritual gifts. But he starts by rooting his narrative in who they are. You are sanctified in Jesus. You're called to be his holy people, together with all those who are everywhere, who call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. There's even association in Paul's words here. And he also roots his narrative in who Christ is. And again, there are so many examples that you can pull from Paul's letters, but he's constantly rooting his vision of himself and the church in his vision of Christ. And I've just chosen one again from Corinthians. You've been enriched in every way with all kinds of knowledge, God's confirming our testimony about Christ among you. And there are so many that you could take. But the point I want to make here is that Paul's letters, Paul's writing, Paul's strategy, Paul's intervention, whatever you want to call those letters, are rooted in his own sense of call and ministry. They're rooted in his understanding of the nature and the purpose of God's people, and rooted in his understanding of God. And as we, if you like, take that stab in the dark of what the future might look like, then it seems to me that perhaps they are 3 things that we might helpfully do. Reroot ourselves in our own calling, reroot ourselves in our vision, or what we believe God's vision for his church is, and reroot ourselves in our vision of Christ. And again, it's interesting to see how that theme of rooted is being echoed. It's been echoed, as we've talked about today, about the vine, about other things in our worship. And why I think this is important is because we recognize that not even the early church always got it. It's interesting that in Acts 1, on the day of Ascension, you find the believers saying to Jesus, will you restore the kingdom? Now the crucifixion is over. Will you press the reset button? And can we just get on with doing what we thought you were going to do? And Jesus says, no, the cross is not, the resurrection is not the place of reset. It's not just a minor inconvenience, that the crucifixion and resurrection, and now we can get back to work because, hey, what, I've overcome it. It's saying, no, this is a redefinition of what it means to be my followers. Now, I'm not wanting to put COVID-19 in the same place as the death and resurrection of Jesus. But what I am saying is that the relational dynamics seem very similar. There are those who say to Jesus, oh, that inconvenience of the cross is over. Can we get back now? Will you at this point restore the kingdom to Israel? And Paul says 20 years later, no, we preach Christ crucified. And dare I say that I think, if I'm honest about the evangelical tradition that I grew up in, I think we were actually very often preaching Christ resurrected. not Christ crucified. And perhaps there is something that we can rediscover. We can find ourselves again in the traditional narrative of the gospel that we're called to. Now, I realize a lot of what I've said is highly theoretical, so I just want to finish with a real life story. And I'll be honest, it's the fusion of two pastoral sort of situations that I've dealt with over the last couple of weeks. But let me just take you through what I think, you know, is perhaps a pretty typical example of the sort of stuff that I've been talking about. So a couple of weeks ago, the roadmap begins to be talked about, and a minister decides we need to just have a think about what this is going to mean for our church youth activity. So they pick up the phone to one of the leading lights of the children's and youth work in the church, and they say, listen, you know, maybe we're going to be working towards some kind of reopening. What are your thoughts? What are you about? You know, how can we begin to at least start the conversation? Now, I think that the person in question realized that they needed the conversation. And immediately, the person who ran that particular children's activity ran the junior school age. Now, was quite a big church, so there were one of those where you had all the different, they all had fancy names these days. They were called primary department and junior department and Sunday school when I was a kid, but they're all now called the Space Explorers and the Intergalactics or whatever. But they were the one who ran what I would call the junior school group. And he said, well, it's really interesting you say that. He said, because I've been looking at the children who came. And he said, what I've realized is that they were all in years 5 and 6. Although we ran for year 3, 4, 5, 6, they were all in years 5 and 6. And most of them were in year 6. So actually, when we come back, they'll all be in year 7. They'll all now be in the next group up. And if we don't get going until September, I've lost all my activity. I've lost my activity. My activity's over. I'm going to need to recruit a whole new generation of kids to carry on doing what I'm doing. Oh, that's a bit of a problem, says the minister. Well, I'll tell you what, let's ring your co-worker. Let's bring them into this and see what they say. So they ring the other co-worker. Yeah, absolutely, they said. So we need to completely restructure our youth work because we need to get back in touch with the kids. Now, immediately, you had two totally conflicting. One of them is saying we've got to get more kids recruited into what we were doing. The other's saying we've got to change what we're doing to re-embrace this group of children who don't fit, because it's the children, that the young people that I relate to. And so they said, and what they then noticed in their conversation is, well, the church website has got all our activities listed as on hold. Maybe we need to change that, because maybe they're not all on hold. Maybe they're not going to start again. And the message on hold suggests that they are going to start. So they spoke to the person who ran the church website and said, could you just change the website so it doesn't say that? The person who ran the church website was absolutely outraged at the thought of this and immediately rang round 4 of their friends to tell them that the entire church youth work was being closed down. At which point, 3 of the other youth workers rang the leaders and said, how dare you do this without consulting with us? And they said, well, hang on a minute, that isn't what we did. And what they realized, of course, was that the person who ran the website was not in any way involved in the leadership of the church, was just, in their eyes, a really helpful person who put all the things they did about 3 days later would appear online. And they suddenly realized that the church website and the churches online had gone from being this fringe thing that just kind of kept a narrative going to being crucial to the strategy and the life of the church. And so what they realized was, just in one conversation, and this is a fusion of 2 stories, and I've changed some of the facts to make sure that it remains anonymous, but the dynamics I've been absolutely true to. And the point is that for one person, the future was an organizational challenge. It was about, how do I just begin to regroup the troops and begin to get the organization working again? For another person, it was an operational challenge. This is what I do. And what COVID has done is made it more difficult for me to do it. So I need to find new people to do it with. For a third player, it was a relational challenge. It was, these are the people that I'm ministering to. That's the way I used to minister to them. I now need to find a different way of ministering to them. But as they began to talk it through, they realized it was also a structural challenge, because actually that bit of church life has suddenly become really important, and other bits of church life have perhaps become less important. And what began as a very simple phone call actually revealed something of the complexity that we may be facing. Now, that's just one example, again, and all I'm trying to do is offer the fact that I'm sitting here offering bullet points and PowerPoint, but actually there are real life stories that are reflected in that. And so what I want to invite you to do is, I hope that what we've done in the last half hour or so is just giving you some framework and some resources to think, okay, how am I finding myself in this world? The one thing I think we do need to be doing right now is buying ourselves that time to think. So I do think that some of the messages we send out now are important. If I can take you back to this particular slide, I think for some people that recovery and discovery phrase just isn't on their radar. Like those people who are saying to Jesus, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? I think there are those who are just expecting that we're just going to open the doors and everything will go back. And I think what we do need to do as leaders, I think, is we may not know when, we may not know what recovery and discovery looks like, but I think we need to start claiming that ground and making sure that there is an awareness within the church, unless you absolutely vehemently disagree with me and you're ready to hit the reset button tomorrow. But most of the people I'm talking to are not feeling that way. And I wonder whether one of the things we do need to be doing strategically is just buying ourselves, and Jane's going to talk a little bit more about this afternoon, but making sure that we claim that middle phase and don't just rush back into things as the way they were. So the messages we send out now may well impact how people perceive this year. But what I want to invite you to do is just start with yourself. And in the next hour or so, just find some time for yourself to make sense. I hope something of what I've said has given you something to think about, even if you disagree with me. Now, you may just want to go make yourself a cup of coffee, go find a corner, go for a walk. We want to give you an hour off the screen. Please take that hour. That's why we've sent you a little letter. And this is the point: you can open your envelope so that you weren't taking a sneak preview at it before, because there are just 3 ways that you might want to reflect that you may find helpful, or you can go and do your own thing. The first of them, I just want to offer you an image. This is an image taken from the film Jesus of Montreal. And I found it quite a disturbing image, but the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought, you know, I think in some respects, that's the Jesus that many of us like. We want a Jesus that we can bring back to life. We want a Jesus that is reliant on our life support systems. And I'm talking here about society as well as the church. And if you find that image helpful as we think about Christ crucified, that may be one way of you just spending some time reflecting. You may be more of a words person. And one of the poems that I found particularly helpful is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Who Am I poem. And he wrestles with the anguish for him of actually being a condemned prisoner, awaiting his execution. And on the one hand, he's just a frail, frightened human being, but because he carries this title of minister, people expect him to be more. And you just might find in his honesty and his wrestling with that some help and some support. Or you may just want to spend some time with the scriptures, and I've offered you those verses that I put together earlier from Romans. Or you may want to do your own thing. The reason we wanted to offer you something here is, please use this time. I know the great thing is now it's going to shut up in a minute. I can switch off my camera. I can get on with my emails. I can catch up with all the other stuff that I can't usually do at the Ministers Conference. I can't stop you from doing that, but we need time for ourselves. We need time away from the screen. We need time with God. We need time to find ourselves in everything that's going on. So I hope that little few thoughts, I'm going to switch off my sharing now. Those few thoughts just give you something. I'm not expecting everyone to agree with everything I've said, but hopefully there's something in that that gives you the opportunity to just take some time and find yourself in the next hour or so.